Hey all, it's Macabre Derek with another RPG rant, and today I wanted to end up discussing inspiring your game master or storyteller. Let the rambling begin. So the reason I ended up thinking about this recently was because in my setting of Winnipeg for Vampire the Masquerade, we just concluded a plot line involving a Sabbat pack that managed to infiltrate and was starting to run havoc. Now, with a lot of strings pulled, we had this is a unique situation, and the reason being is that we had two established characters and a third one that was just coming in. I think this was his third session. Now, what was happening was is beforehand, I ended up having to split the coterie and ended up making sure that everything was all hunky dory on them both ends. And with two players, it's okay to split, right? It gives one person a little bit of time to think about what they're going to do because of their situation, while giving the other player a chance to really end up shining. Gives it a little bit of pacing, which I didn't mind. But as soon as you end up getting to three players and trying to end up getting them to work, well, it gets a little bit more difficult. But that's another time. But the important thing is when all things finally culminated, this one instance where all three characters got together, the coterie is finally assembled, and one of the coterie members dies. Now, sometimes the dice are unforgiving, sometimes you just got to play the choices. But this left me with a bit of a dilemma because the character that died was kind of a linchpin to a lot of the other ideas that I had going. And this can happen, especially if you're trying to end up building a player driven narrative. You end up finding more often than not that all your plots that were focused around these characters, well, what happens when they die? Well, that's a good time to sit and take stock of what you do have. So, if you're a player, one thing I would always recommend, go to your GM frequently and talk to them about the game from your character's perspective. Don't just say why you were going to do this or this. Sometimes that is warranted. But one thing that I ended up finding that really ended up helping me when I'm running a game, especially, and your GM can thank you for a fair amount, especially if it seems like he's a little fuzzy on the details right now, is give them a chance to conduct what I like to think of as a character interview. You sit down with the player in a one-on-one side bet, and you just start discussing who this character is, right? You should know this from your background. You should do all this, but not all the stuff is in the background, and not everybody ends up writing an 18-page spread. But they have enough for that core of a character where we know who this character is. That and once the player maybe has felt it out a bit more, because I can tell you right now, I've seen several characters change dragonal inception, and they just became something else entirely. This is either through inflection, maybe the player wasn't exactly caring for the style, so they started drifting into another. Maybe they, quite frankly, are still struggling to build really fleshed out characters. So it kind of ends up helping. This is especially important at the start of the game, but don't be afraid to do this in the middle of the game. Derek, you're rambling on about doing this thing, but what exactly are you doing? Well, I ended up taking the time, and I actually have some notes. And I ended up conducting one player interview that basically culminated in, you can barely see that, 2 pages worth of notes. And every one of those notes is a plot hook. And every one of those notes is a plot. I didn't show them what I was writing. I just ended up making it a point. Like, okay, so what is your character looking to do now? Because your character's goals will change, especially the short-term stuff. So your short-term stuff starts to change. Maybe they want to end up starting to hold land titles. Maybe they aspire to get revenge against that one escapee of this pain in the backside that they had to deal with. The other party, in this case the pack, one member had escaped and is most definitely plotting revenge. Made reference to that in a previous video. But there's also more to it, because you could start asking them, well, what about your mother? What about your father? What about your family? What was it like growing up? You know, you and ask the details that you probably don't get in a backstory, because to write all of this stuff down usually ends up making it so that you end up getting the wall of text. And even if it isn't a situation of too long didn't read, maybe you have a really good attention span. I don't, clearly. It's one of the reasons we ramble. You can still find little nuggets, but if you can ask more questions on top of that about that, like what was their relationship like? You know, did you like your brothers and sisters? Who was your best friend growing up? What was the best thing that happened to you in life? What was it where he was happy? What was his worst moment in life? What did you end up finding happened when this character died? You know, especially around player deaths, you want to end up finding some way to end up making that a bit more impactful. As a player, it's definitely your job to make that death impact. You got to find some way to end up making it count. I will say this, nothing is more rewarding to me when I end up losing a player than for that player to be referenced later on, that was an important person in the lives of the people I'm going to continue playing with, but with another character. You know, I get to end up having these references, and I get to end up knowing that what I did mattered. And yes, you can do this as a GM, but it is so much more potent as a player. And these can become plot hooks, right? What if, in a recent game, for instance, a one-off session, one of the players ended up running into a family member of a friend of his who died 3-4 months back, and now all of a sudden it's like, wait, I thought your family was rich. What are you doing in this rundown apartment building? What are you doing here where, you know, everything's falling apart and, you know, the paint's peeling and it's probably made of lead? And that unto itself starts a small plot arc. They could investigate, they could not. They might feel the need to pursue this because they're going to look after the surviving kin. Maybe they see an in into trying to end up getting their foothold in this corporation that the other characters or the other character had a foothold in, you know, kind of cannibalizing what's left. There's a few ways they can go about it, but at least it's there and it's showing impact. And you can draw players in that regard. There's also in bits where you can end up asking your player, or your player can make a point of making mention to the GM. And I really feel like you should end up doing this in a point where your GM can write this down. What it is you want to explore as a player in this world. If your GM has seeded the world with enough details, enough little things to end up coming about, enough plots and NPCs and locations and things that are curious, it suddenly feels so much better when you end up saying, I'm going to explore this. And the GM, in turn, has a little bit more time to know that I should be fleshing this out a bit more, and I don't have to worry about this as much. Still put some effort into them, but you can at least hedge your bets. If you're trying to force players to go into a location or into a direction, that's fine. But if you're trying to, or no, that's not fine. Let me try. Let's try that again, shall we? From the top. If you're trying to force players to do a general direction, their knee-jerk reaction every single time will be to try and go off that path and find something else. It's almost like a rebellious streak I find in players, and that's fine because something along this plot that you end up doing just caught their attention. They want to run this way. Well, that's not the main plot. Well, screw the main plot then. I'm sorry. This is the characters' stories, and if this is what they're interested in, this is what's going to happen. Sure, what you had planned is just going to run forward and maybe bite the players in the ass a little bit later, but that suddenly makes their decisions matter. When talking to the players, I keep end up saying, asking questions: who, what, where, when, why, how. Right? You got little tidbits, and you might find that there's some associations between players and players, NPCs and players, and little details you can suddenly bring about that suddenly add a little bit of a twist, a shock value, because no one else was thinking about it, especially if you're doing these interviews separately. Because then all of a sudden, the players, when they end up running into this situation, think that it was about their character. And this was specifically built for that. Well, if everybody's feeling like that on the board and just having that bit where they really want to run with it, maybe they'll say it's, like, but this is, maybe this involves my mother. Well, that's great, but this involves my company. Well, what happens if it involves that one person who got away? Well, for you, everybody's involved. Everybody's eyes glued to the screen. So that's typically how I want to end up tangling it. Start with a simple example. Okay. I'm going to talk in vampire terms. So, simple question. What kind of haven do you have? All right. Where is it located? How did you get it? How do you keep it secure? How does this benefit you? How is it designed? Right? Put some flavor into this one location, which is your haven. Now, okay. Well, what about this what is around this haven? Well, not much. It's 2 apartment buildings here, a gas station. 2 apartments over here and a gas station means I got about 50 people I can end up interjecting in any given time for a plot. That suddenly becomes very relevant because it's happening right beside your haven. And if you're a vampire, you do not want attention. What happens when you find out that the neighbor that's right across from your apartment also has late night escapades? But his late night escapade is that he's a hunter in training, being brought up by a couple of other hunters, small cell. You might want to be a little leery. Maybe you want to move, maybe you want to divert them, maybe you want to end up giving them the suggestion that here's an enemy of mine. And I'm not going to state it like that, obviously, but, put them in the right direction. Suddenly, oh, look, the hunters happen to be dealing with a problem that I don't have to touch. Maybe you can influence that hunter a bit, make a kind of unholy alliance. Well, there's a few plot hooks, and when we do this, we got this from just asking about a haven. What happens if we end up asking about family? Where did your mother work? Where did you hit? What happened to your brothers? What happened to your sister? Who are they married into? You can write this stuff down, and if they say I haven't seen them in years, even better. Start talking about. Ask them, even if you're doing this at the table. You don't have to do those all at the side, but I find to the side means I can get focused and detailed notes. But you end up coming into the large banquet hall, and it's a large party meet and greet. And suddenly you see a family member. Who is this family member? They suddenly have to go, oh, right, well, who was that? They might not have a name. They might pull one entirely out of their ass. You want to know what? You end up writing down, and you end up asking them questions about what was your relationship like? You have them build that NPC for you, and you just write down a little bit of notes because you got to remember they know as much about this NPC as you do, but you can start fleshing it out just by asking a few questions and have them go into a little bit of detail and maybe gain them used to crafting this idea. This is actually probably one of the best experiences you can have as a player if you want to end up learning to GM. But then you take that and you just make it a small encounter. It doesn't have to be the complete focus, but it could be the hook. Then you go back to your notes, what you discussed earlier, and then you end up starting to flesh it out. What happened while they were gone? What are all those little details? And you can draw so much inspiration just from the players in this regard. Players, though, it's on you guys to end up telling your GM what you want. And you giving them as much as you can to be inspired. What are you wanting to do? Where are you going? What are you keeping an eye on? What are you worried about? What's got your interest? What do you really want to do next session? What did you think? What did you think about this? What happened in previous session? Is this on your mind, or is that business done, taken care of? Wash my hands of it and move on. Just so long as you keep asking questions.